Hi everybody. My name is Resha. I lead EDR and XDR product marketing here at SentinelOne. And with me, I have Michael Leland, who's the Chief Technology Cyber Strategist here at SentinelOne. And today we will be talking about MITRE. We'll talk or just give an overview as Michael is sharing here, give overview of what is MITRE. If you can go one more slide.
Yep.
Yes. What is MITRE? Some of the newer, less popular introductions, such as, the MITRE Defend framework, the newer stuff like MITRE Deception. We'll also go over the attack evaluations and matrix, and then go over how you can use MITRE to enhance SecOps practices.
Great. Thanks, Risha. So hopefully, most of you should be aware of MITRE, and many of you have probably heard of the attack framework. We're going to talk more about that. But a quick introduction into just the general philosophy of MITRE, right? MITRE was developed as a publicly facing NIST-sponsored organization that is primarily focused at R&D. Their goal is to understand the adversarial landscape, helping to build a framework and a methodology for describing the techniques, tactics, and procedures used by adversary in the course of an attack. So their source of information, is pretty broad, right? From threat intel reports and malware analysis. They do mining of social media and blogs. And then, of course, the vendors get to participate in what they call the evaluation process, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. The goal of the evaluations is to emulate what an attacker actually does in a real world attack scenario. And so in doing so, they will activate certain techniques that fall in line with columns called tactics. You'll see that framework in a minute. And it really understands and helps to evaluate the behaviors that take place when an attacker is in the middle of an active attack. And the goal of this is to help both consumers of the framework as well as vendors who are building technologies to align to the framework, to understand where coverage exists, how well they're providing efficacy for certain technique detections that fall into tactic coverage. And the goal of tactic understanding is to understand along the attack lifecycle, at certain stages, they will need to perform or activate certain capabilities. They'll need to land and expand. They'll need to establish a foothold. They'll need to do lateral movement. They'll need to do privilege escalation before they finally get to the crown jewels and start having an impact like ransoming or exfiltrating data. It's also important to understand what the attack framework is not. It doesn't test everything and every scenario. It's really guided by the principles of a specific attack in its end-to-end process. It doesn't evaluate whether or not you stopped something. It detects whether or not you detected it. So it actually highlights where you have visual exposure to the attack having taken place. And the measurements are typically taken in terms of how well you provided visual validation that you saw an attack behavior take place. But if you think about an attack, an adversary is not going to play out the exact same attack every time. He's going to tune his attack behaviors. He's going to find different methodologies that are working in particular scenarios. And in fact, he'll use very different tactics and strategies depending on even the customer he's targeting or the vertical he's interested in. So it really looks at specific threat groups, threat actors, and we're going to cover a couple of those in this session as well. And the goal at the end of an attack evaluation and in our understanding of the attack framework is to help us as vendors and us in the security community as practitioners to better understand what the attacker's methods and motives are, so we can see how to better provide a defense in-depth strategy to provide alignment to the solution and architectures that allow us the greatest visibility into the attacks taking place, and also help you as a consumer select vendors that align to specific capabilities. And we'll talk more about that as we go. So while we talk a lot about the attack framework, which is our understanding of how attackers move through an attack scenario, and each of these columns are tactics and each of the boxes in blue are techniques. And by the way, there are many, many techniques that could be employed by a given adversary for any one of these tactic categories, but most people are not aware of the other side of the coin. Attack is all about how we understand how the attacker is moving through the environment The defend framework is actually how the product itself could have prevented at various stages certain techniques being employed by the adversary. So as the technique is being identified in the attack framework, it produces telemetry. That telemetry is then observed as digital artifacts. And the defend framework, which is relatively new and not employed by very many organizations yet, but it allows us to understand from the defense perspective how certain products would have fared under given attack scenarios. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of those kind of as we flow through as well. Now, the attack framework itself is exhaustive and it's extensive, and this isn't even the entire list. And while I'm indicating each of the technique categories, note that there are potentially 2 or 4 or 10 or more sub-techniques that are employed underneath each of these. So there may be 5 or 6 different methodologies for doing the forced authentication or the keychain capability. So while this is, and this list in fact extends well beyond the real estate of this screen, so you can see that it also is broken into the attack pattern behaviors across the timeline of an attack as it plays out, all the way from initial access through the far right, which is impact. Now, it is fair to say that the earlier the evaluation detects something and provides visual validation that it identified an attack behavior, the more telemetry we have access to gather. And more importantly, when we pivot over to defend in a minute, it's pretty obvious that the easier and more quickly we can shift left, providing indicators of compromise on the left-hand side before they make it to the right will improve our chances of reducing the adversary dwell time and reducing any potential impact that adversarial activity might have. So there's a number of tools that can be used, and we'll talk about the navigator in a minute. But keep in mind that, again, under each of these techniques, there are a number of sub-techniques, and that's why heat mapping of a technique coverage is a little difficult and misleading, because while you may have coverage for a specific technique or sub-technique, if you don't have broad coverage across the entire chain of techniques, the adversary may still find that one methodology that is still effective. So keep in mind that this is an exhaustive list, but it's also a living, breathing list. As adversaries are identifying new techniques that are effective, MITRE is also learning about those through their research and updating this as it evolves. Now, the defend framework I mentioned is the flip side of the coin. While attack is all about identifying the attacker as they come through, defend is all about how a product could put up defensive measures against those attacks. And this one's broken up into 5 main categories. The hardening of our defenses, and that is how capable is a product at putting up preventative measures to where the attacker has fewer locations or areas where they can, in fact, approach a vulnerable object. The detect phase, similar to the attack phase, is all about when the attacker is employing their techniques, what telemetry can be gathered that guarantees or confirms that the detection and analysis of that attack has been thoroughly thought through, all the way through the isolation phase and the deception phase, which is all about understanding, can we throw roadblocks in the way of the attacker? This might be through the use of decoy files or decoy assets. In the deception phase, you can even go as far as to say that there could be virtual environments hosted in the enterprise that you might deploy or employ lures. So think of the days when we used to have sandboxes, or what we used to call honeypots. That hasn't changed in today's evolution, but honeypots have really given way to entire enterprise infrastructure that mimics your environment with your OSs, with your applications, and the ability to lure attackers in there, gain a lot of valid or vital information about what the attacker is trying to do, the techniques and methods he's employing to make those attempts, and it allows us to improve our defenses by monitoring what they're doing in our air-gapped environment, kind of our walled garden. And then lastly, the eviction stage. How quickly can a product identify, detect the attacker in process, isolate or deceive that attacker, and then lastly, kick them out, right? The goal is, of course, to shift left in this environment as well. The earlier we can provide hardening defenses against the exposures and vulnerabilities that are leveraged by attackers, through the detection phase of understanding exactly based on their behavioral techniques, what they're attempting to do, understanding their motives and their methods. And then if we can shift left, we get a better understanding and attempt to minimize dwell time. So one of the key tools out there for this has actually been developed by MITRE. It's called the MITRE Attack Navigator. It's a way of understanding, based on adversarial activities, exactly what might be employed through the life cycle of an attack. Right? It looks at the objectives of the attacker. Right? What are the technique trying to accomplish? It looks at the actions of the attackers as well. Like, how is this technique being performed? Who's using it? What adversarial campaigns, what threat actor groups are using these? And so by using the navigator, we can actually employ this methodology where you can defend or determine, based upon your infrastructure, what might happen if a certain attack actor came in. And we're going to talk about a couple of those threat actors in a minute. It is a web-based tool. It's very simple to use and free, of course. It allows you to kind of annotate and explore the metrics, the matrices of MITRE. Now, it's also important to know that as not every attack is the same, not every attacked environment is the same. And so MITRE has actually gone to the extent to say that not just one attack map should be sufficient. There's one for the enterprise. There's one specifically for mobile attack vectors. And more recently, there's one now for industrial control. So IT, OT convergence, industrial control environments, SCADA environments. Attackers employing different techniques against those scenarios will have very different outcomes and ways of mapping against the framework. So use Navigator as a tool to help understand what the attack patterns look like. The most important thing about this is the annotation that's provided inside of the tool, and all of the deep learning and information that sits behind this. Every one of these is clickable. It will show you what the methodologies are, and it'll also provide some prescriptive recommendations on what you should be considering to either prevent an attack, discover an attack, or provide telemetry about the attack pattern at various stages.
Thank you, Michael. So as Michael said, that the enterprise attack evaluation, they have been the most popular that they have done for evaluations so far. They have had evaluated a few groups, as you see there. So they started with APD3, which was Gothic Panda. Now this is a Chinese-based threat group that was first discovered, I want to say somewhere around 2010. And this is linked to the Chinese ministry, China's intelligence service, and held responsible for several popular campaigns. Then they evaluated in the next year APD29 or Cozy Bear, and this is a Russian adversary group. They were mainly attributed to the election hacking and attack against major government organizations. The third here, they focused on Carbanek and Fin7. And as you see, you'll see that there is a theme for every year's evaluations of the adversary group. So Carbanek and Fin7, they were financially motivated threat group so Carbanek kind of targeted US banks, and Fin7 targeted US retail and restaurants, using the point of sale devices. Again, their motive was to get financial gain. This year's evaluations focused on data encryption for impact, meaning ransomware. Again, they evaluated two groups, Wizard Spider and Sandworm. Wizard Spider is like a very financially motivated criminal group. And this is not like a small hacker operating in a basement. They're really organized. They have management levels. It's kind of like a enterprise, like financially run enterprise. And they've been conducting ransomware campaigns using Ryuk malware against a variety of organizations, corporations, hospitals. And then Sandworm also uses ransomware, but they use ransomware for destructive purposes. These are state-sponsored, and they use the NotPetya, known for the NotPetya ransomware attack. And they were also attributed to the 2016 targeting of the Ukraine electrical grid outage that was there. And the latest evaluation that will happen next year is TERLA. And now TERLA is again a Russian-based threat group. They are focusing on like highly targeted watering hole and spear phishing campaigns. And their goal is to extract and exfiltrate sensitive information. So most of their attacks are against government agencies world over. Past notable targets are, Pentagon, U.S. government and military groups, and they had notable links to the Sunburst SolarWind campaigns. And all of these adversary groups, even if the ones that were evaluated a few years ago, they're still very currently relevant, still kind of used, the tactics and techniques are still kind of used today. If you go to the next slide, Michael. Yeah. So, as Michael mentioned, the most common, the most popular one evaluation that MITRE did was the enterprise attack evaluation metrics. So we'll just go over the scoring rubric for that. But earlier in the year, they also did a deception evaluation, which was first for its kind. They're also coming up with an MDR evaluation that will be published sometime next year. And then they are also coming up with the CWPP evaluation. So as you see, as the enterprise attack evaluation gained traction, gained popularity, a lot of SOC started using it. They are kind of spreading out to other parts of the SOC and trying to get the same TTP, same kind of methodology to evaluate defenses. So for the enterprise evaluation, the way MITRE kind of scores vendors is it starts with you have no visibility, no miss, like nothing, pretty self-explanatory, to on the right-hand side, it gets more and more sophisticated. So you start with the miss as if you don't see anything. Then the second piece is you have telemetry. Now this is somewhere where you can actually have visibility, but that is it. There is no other context. It's like a log recorder. Then is what MITRE calls analytic detections. Again, it gets more sophisticated as you go from left to right. So there is general, which tells you I see that it happened and I see something bad has happened, but that is about it. Then you have something called tactic, which is, yes, I see it happen. I see something bad happened, and I see why the attacker was trying to do that. And the most sophisticated of this is technique, where it not only tells you that something bad's happened, why the attacker was trying to do, but it gives you detailed explanation and detailed knowledge of what kind of techniques and what kind of steps the attacker was using to trying to get to their objective. And ideally, the more techniques anybody can identify, the more techniques you can, you can detect, that is better, because it gives the SOC team a lot of context around what is happening. MITRE also has something called modifiers, and this is, there are two that they kind of settled on after a few back and forths, and the two are config change and delayed. The config change modifier means that if a vendor needs to adjust their configuration during the evaluation, they will let them do that, but they will mark and note that this was a config change that happened. And the second modifier, which to me is very critical, is whether this was real time or it was delayed. And, if it was delayed, currently MITRE doesn't note how long it delays, whether it was 1 hour, whether it was 5 hours, or whether it was 12 hours. It just marks delayed in the detections. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, starting last 2 years, MITRE also added protection as the evaluation categories, and the protection evaluation was pretty straightforward. Not every vendor participated in the protection piece, and if it was not applicable to them, then it was just NA. If you did participate and if you did not provide any protection, if you let the entire step kind of execute, then you would get none. And of course, if you would, if you protect, if you blocked it and if you provided protection, then you would get a blocked notifier.
Now, Risha, one interesting thing about this is we as security practitioners hope that our security tools will block and block early, but to block early also means that you're preventing further steps from being determined later on. So how does MITRE handle the fact that a block early on is actually of significant advantage to an evaluation, even though that means you're not going to have significant technique detection in later steps?
Yeah, so if you look at it, realistically, in the detection category, you will actually like block some of the stuff where we will let actually the adversaries, get into your network, do some of the things. Ideally, what you like to do is block on early and then, still have context around it. So with the protection piece, and if you look currently today in the MITRE website, you will see a particular step and say 10 sub-steps that would have executed if you're not blocked. You should block it early enough where, any material damage does not happen.
Great.
And if you look at the next slide, now, like I mentioned earlier, this year MITRE also carried out something called deception evaluation. They evaluated vendors for their deception capabilities. And for this, they emulated the APT29, so the Cozy Bearer threat adversary. And they evaluated vendors for two things. First was, did the adversary, encounter any deception? So if when the adversary was in the network, did they see anything which was, different, which was a deceptive, right? So that was the first piece. And the second piece was, if they did observe, did they engage? Now, the observe piece is pretty straightforward, whether the red team, the MITRE red team, or who were acting like the threat group, did they observe anything? Pretty straightforward. But the engage piece is a little more subjective. They could observe it and they could choose not to engage. They could engage and go so many different ways. So there was a little bit of kind of a subjective piece over there. But they also saw whether the red team engaged into what the vendor was showing them.
I think it's important to note too that on the observation phase, there are technologies that allow us to deceive or misdirect an adversary by feeding him false information, right? And that's typically using tools like decoy files, decoy file shares, decoy Active Directory accounts, and by an adversary enumerating AD and deciding that that an attacker's target would be something like a domain admin account. The enumeration of the AD would be the observation, right? He queried AD, he got back a list of what he believes to be domain admins that he would like to elevate privilege to. If he then attempts to elevate privilege into that AD, either through like a silver ticket or a Kerberosing attack technique, that would be the actual engagement. Is that right?
That is correct. And actually, if you go to the next slide, it shows the different use cases that that evaluation kind of targeted. Michael, if you want to talk about these.
Sure. So when we talk about protecting the attack surfaces, right, we all know that protection of endpoints and servers is critical, protection of mobile devices, cloud workloads, and containers is critical. But I think the one thing that most enterprises that I talk to miss is the protection of the AD infrastructure and the identities contained therein. So don't forget about the surface that is widely exposed. About 90 to 93% at last survey of enterprises are leveraging Active Directory, both on-prem and in cloud or hybrid, like through Azure AD. It's also well known that 80% of the most recent successful attacks and breaches have leveraged vulnerabilities, exploits, or let's say entitlements or over privileges in the Active Directory environment. So MITRE took it upon themselves to kind of address that subject by talking about deception as it relates to the identity infrastructure. That's AD and LDAP platforms. So protecting against AD compromise is actually made up of two things. One is hardening that AD environment, and that is understanding what all of the exposures are in that platform, what vulnerabilities exist, what accounts are visible to what class of user. And then the last piece is if you identify the vulnerabilities and can close as many of those holes as possible, you're effectively kind of putting a moat around AD at that point. But it's also important to understand that there are still attack scenarios where a user, whether it's a threat actor who's found his way onto an endpoint, or even a malicious insider who's going to abuse his own privileges, will make certain requests of Active Directory for both reconnaissance, trying to enumerate those values, and then leveraging that to further their attack. So the ability for MITRE to evaluate whether or not you have real-time protection against AD is really both, do I know and can I close all of the vulnerable exposures that I have that could be potentially exploitable to an attacker? And then do I have the appropriate methodology to intercept and interpret the communications to and from the Active Directory controllers, domain controllers, to identify when an attack might be present. The big step that is overlooked in most evaluations that don't consider identity is the lateral movement and privilege escalation. These can be done no matter whose endpoint technology security solution you're using, because they're typically leveraging live off the land style attacks. They're using things like PowerShell or LDAP admin, or they could even be looking to mine credentials directly out of applications sitting on the endpoint that are not being monitored by additional technologies. So the MITRE evaluation looked at use cases where lateral movement and privilege escalation were taking place and whether or not the technology stack employed could actually detect and defend against those attacks.
And would this include like stuff like golden ticket attack and silver ticket attack?
Those are exactly the ones that I think or that I remember were evaluated in this scenario, because those are ones that have been responsible for some of the largest attacks recently. The latest Uber attack and I believe the Cisco attack both leverage those in particular. So identifying when those patterns are being seen, defending against those in real time is something that MITRE placed a very high emphasis on in the evaluation. The other thing is understanding that there are certain assets which should be completely invisible to an attacker or an insider who is trying to move laterally, and the ability for you for an organization to protect those assets by hiding them completely, right? If I, on a machine that I have access to and I have not even administrative rights on, just local rights, I have access to live off the land tools that allow me to enumerate both LDAP, AD structures, as well as the network environment itself. So I can do a net command and find out what file shares I have access to. I can then traverse those risky paths and find ways to maneuver through your environment to identify the crown jewels that I'm attempting to either exfiltrate or ransom or both. So data cloaking is a way of returning misleading information that will either stop the attacker cold by not providing him any insight into a next step, or to go one step further, to actually misdirect them into an adversarial holding ground, something like a honeypot, right? So critical asset cloaking is all about understanding that an adversary needs to do certain enumeration and reconnaissance to identify how he's going to move vertically and laterally, and the ability to prevent those early will stop an attacker from progressing in his steps. And then lastly, making sure that we have as much insight into those behaviors as possible. If we do attempt or see an attempt to move laterally, it would make a whole lot more sense to move them into an environment where I can then monitor him, where he can do no harm, let him run around wild in an environment that looks just like our crown jewels, but in fact is a completely bogus, illegitimate environment. But once we get him in there, we're monitoring everything he does. We're learning the techniques he's using. We're learning the methods that he feels are successful and effective in his offense. And from that, we can then tune our defenses to make sure that our production servers and assets are better protected against those specific techniques. So it's not just about shunting the user off and letting him play. It's about learning what he does when he's in that environment so we can strengthen our defenses. MITRE allows us to red team in a safe environment. It allows us to build a set of understandings and define it and describe it in a common nomenclature given to us by MITRE to actively describe all of the steps along the entire attack path.
Yeah, and one thing to add over there is Michael mentioned the attack framework and the defend framework early on. There is also another framework called engage, which is kind of mapped to deception. And so the deception evaluation kind of mapped the techniques and tactics to the engage framework to kind of see how deception cloaking was used.
Some of you might have heard about something called MITRE Shield. MITRE Shield is now that MITRE Engage. It's been rebranded. It's still in its beta form, but gaining traction every release.
Absolutely. And all of these kind of frameworks, help you kind of, build your practices to kind of get better defenses. And all this is good, but how do you kind of use this in a practical way? So first is, plan a holistic cybersecurity strategy. So you can use all of these attack frameworks and TTPs to kind of build your cybersecurity strategy, build your defenses to counter the techniques known to be used, say, against your specific type of organization, whether it's financial services, whether it's healthcare, what have you, and equip yourself with that security monitoring to detect evidence of attack techniques in your specific network. So that's the first one. And second is kind of create an adversary emulation plan, like take it further, create an adversary emulation plan. Now, what is an adversary emulation plan? It basically models adversary behavior based on a particular set of TTPs in the MITRE attack framework. So they outline the behavior of a threat group matched to attack, and they're used by the emulation teams to test an organization's security and security products against specific threats. And one of the most critical components, I would say, of a detailed plan is a specific breakdown of TTPs of the adversary group, and your red team must identify the TTPs the group uses for an attack, like look at them in details. Much of that information is available on the MITRE's website. Your red team also must detail the tools that they would use to emulate a particular TTP. Again, this information is available on the MITRE attack website, in the description of the adversary group, or you can just do a Google search of the vulnerability that was exploited or the attack methodology, and you can figure out, what tools you should use. So basically, more detailed your red team is able to make the phase, make the emulation plan, the better results you will get in the end. The third step is to run the attack simulation as if it's the real adversary. Now, this includes resources and activities like an external command and control server, the proper infiltration and exploitation techniques, and the completion of data exfiltration. And what this does is that it helps the red team develop and deploy a consistent and a highly organized approach to defining the TTPs of specific threats, and then logically assess that environment to see, hey, does the defense work as they were planning to? The fourth piece over here is, once you're done with your emulation plan, once you run the simulation, analyze and identify the gaps in defenses and help the blue teams, better understand the components of a potential ongoing cyber attack to understand the gaps in their defenses. And once they understand the gaps, they can take proactive steps to implement solutions to remediate that. And finally, share, get a report, share it across different teams, whether it's red team, blue teams, IT teams, whatever you may have, and develop a process and technology improvement plan based on the results of the attack simulation, and incorporate that results into, you start with one group and then start having different adversary group simulations, so you can kind of plan a holistic strategy and influence other technology decisions. And this is a loop, this is a constant process. You need to periodically do this, and the results you get kind of get fed into your planning of your next strategy or your next emulation plan.
The other thing that's important here is this is an iterative process, right? You don't just run the test once using one set of parameters and then measure your efficacy based on that. Adversaries don't just have one playbook, right? They may have one playbook that may diverge or bifurcate in certain steps and say, I tried to enumerate AD using this, that didn't work. I tried it a second way, this way. I tried to elevate privileges using 3 different techniques. Each test run of this should have a very specific set of goals and objectives, and more importantly, parameters that drive the branching of this of the test scenario. And the tooling you use to employ these attack simulations should have enough variability that lets you tune the process a couple of times, run it through several times, and find out we're well defended against technique XYZ, but this other one, if they had chosen that path, we may be more vulnerable. So it's important to understand that it's not a one and done. It's going to be an iterative, repetitive process, and a methodical one. Understanding where the vulnerabilities are and understanding that attackers will change the game midstream. If they're running into obstacles in one technique, they may attempt others. So getting a clean bill of health with one run through isn't a sign that you have no vulnerabilities or exposures. Realize that the attacker is not going to stop if he hits one brick wall. He's going to try another technique, another methodology. So the right tooling helps you understand how to tune your attack scenarios to get the best efficacy and determination, so that when you finally do develop your reporting, it's complete. It says we have great coverage in this area, but in this area there are a couple of techniques which are still vulnerable. We are still vulnerable and have potential exposures, and it allows you to prioritize and assess where the investments need to be made to improve the defenses across the entire enterprise.
I think that's a very important point, Michael. And like you said, this is not one and done. I mean, all of us know like security is not a silver bullet. I mean, you need to repeat this process, and not just this process, make sure that you have the broader processes and people involved have buy into this so that this can be holistically implemented on a regular basis. Absolutely.
The last thing I'll say too is on the reporting side, the security operations team may not have authority or control over the various organizational units that need to provide some remediations. So if you identify certain things, let's say in firewall rules, right? The security team may not be the same one as the IT team that actually implements these. So having a consistent way of communicating this and giving them quantitative proof that says, we ran these tests, here are the vulnerabilities or holes we found. I need to hand it off to you, but you need to then communicate back to me to let me know I fixed that, I tuned the policy, and then rerun the test and make sure that you confirm any of the diagnoses that come out as part of that reporting.
Yeah, and ideally it would be great if the report is as detailed as possible, like things like, what techniques were tested and what was the result, and, what happened, were there detections, were there misses, if there were detections, what kind of detections were there. The more detailed report you have, the better remediation options and better planning that you can put into the next one. Absolutely. So again, this is just a recap of what we were talking about, like why should you do this and why should you use MITRE and SecOps? First is it's a common lexicon for all of the different stakeholders, between not only your team in the organization, but across vendors and threat intel providers. It provides a common lexicon, a common language for everybody or to talk the same language, so which is great. Everybody's now on the same common ground. Second, it helps us understand like what the adversaries, who are our adversaries and how they attack us, what's their game plan, what are they thinking, and not only what they're thinking, what exactly they plan to do to achieve their objectives. So this is super helpful in helping us understand that and proactively look at things we can do to blunt those adversaries, things we can do to build remediation solutions to kind of identify those gaps we talked about and mitigate them. And, it helps us kind of clearly communicate the exact nature of the threat, again, because of the common lexicon that we would now use with MITRE, and helps us kind of respond faster. And finally, I would say that, this is such a huge step forward, because now this MITRE has given us kind of a data-driven threat informed model, in a way which is not brittle. Like before MITRE, you would use stuff like IP addresses or, other things which were brittle and which were expiring. And, with IP addresses changing, it would not mean the same anymore. And then taking that focus into tactics and techniques, it helps us kind of apply that intelligence to your entire cybersecurity operations. So super kind of helpful.
So, a little self-serving in this slide, but I just want to point out that every vendor who submits tooling or technologies to be evaluated as part of one of the Ingenuity test suites, or in this case, both the attack and the deception side of things, it's important to understand that vendors will always wave their flag saying, we won the MITRE test. There is no winners at the MITRE test. What there are quantitative results that came out of a methodical test plan. And as Risha mentioned earlier, it's all about understanding to what level, detail, and granularity of telemetry and detection technique coverage each vendor has produced. So when you start looking at results from MITRE, the analytic technique discovery that Risha mentioned is really important. And the farther right you go, you can claim the better discovery of the adversarial behaviors. So pay close attention to not only how many detections were identified as part of an evaluation, how quickly those detections were made, and as Risha mentioned, they don't indicate how long a delay might be. But it matters a lot when a SOC analyst is evaluating an attack. If his telemetry shows up 5 minutes later, he can probably still deal with it in the context of an attack. But if it takes 4 hours or 12 hours, that's going to get lost in the noise. So pay close attention to also the number of changes or modifications that needed to be made for that vendor detection to take place, right? Go ahead.
If I can add, not only will it get lost in the noise and the barrage of alerts, just imagine the amount of critical damage an attacker can do if they are undetected in your network for, say, 4 hours, So having things as real time as possible is definitely the key here.
When it comes to detections that were only possible once configuration changes were made, right? Ask yourself this. Is an adversary going to wait till you tune your policy, making it harder for him, or is he going to just try to find the weakest link and exploit that? So any vendor that says we had 100% detection, but we had to make certain configuration changes in the middle of the test, right? It's like asking for a mulligan. You don't get that chance in the real world. So the fewer number of changes required and the fewer number of missed or delayed detections is something you should clearly be evaluating your vendor decision based on. We are happy to say that we have been leaders, and by leaders, we mean we had the highest number of high fidelity, high quality technique detection with the fewest, if any, number of configuration changes or delays. And so while no vendor can say they won, we feel very proud of the fact that we have fared through all 3 of the last 3 MITRE evaluations with incredibly high scores. And this is all public information you can see on MITRE's website and of course on ours as well. In addition to the attack evaluation, we were one of the few vendors that participated but fared incredibly well at the deception evaluation. So again, it was a trial run of this technique or practice. We expect more of these going forward, and we will be bringing our latest and greatest technology to both the deception evaluations, which are part of Defend, as well as the Engage evaluations as they start becoming relevant. We have built our entire platform around this holistic approach that says protecting an endpoint isn't enough, protecting a cloud infrastructure or workload isn't enough. It has to be a combination of a number of things. So we lead the industry in endpoint detection response. We lead the industry now in cloud workload protection as well in these evaluations. And the third leg of that stool that we now call our Singularity XDR platform is identity. And I spent a fair amount of time talking earlier about the relevance of the identity attack exposure, simply because most customers are not thinking about identity as an attack surface. They may be performing biannually gap analysis, where they'll have an organization or a tool come in and do an evaluation or an assessment of the exposures present on their domain controllers and Azure AD. But it's typically then a reactive scenario where they have to then go dispatch people to fix these things. And even if it's a prescriptive set of steps, half of the customers we talk to that have received an evaluation by a third party never get around to implementing all of the changes required to close those holes. So from our perspective, a continuous assessment of your identity infrastructure, treating identity as one of those critical attack surfaces is really what rounds out our Singularity XDR platform. And with that, I would love to open it up for questions. I'll be honest, I've not been monitoring the Q&A right now. Resha, do you see any active or open questions?
Yes, absolutely. So I want to say to everybody that the recording will be available if you're attending this or if you registered and somebody mentioned that they did not have for the last session. Our apologies. We will make sure to send out to you. There's one more question on average, how long this process should take, including iterations. And I'm presuming that means the loop that we showed for the SecOps practices. It actually really depends. It depends on, which adversary you're trying to emulate. Some are relatively more, I'm going to say relatively more straightforward than others. Also, it depends on, how detailed of detections and techniques and tactics that you're looking to monitor. So it kind of depends, but I would say like from establishing your emulation plan to actually having a test report should be around 6 weeks. The first one might be longer because that's the first time you're kind of designing and you learn a lot out of the process, which you can apply into your next one. Did you have anything to add, Michael, over there?
No, I think you raised a really good point. The first time you do it, it might feel a little painful because you're still working out your processes for getting it done. Tooling will help you considerably. There are a number of tools that help you perform these evaluations in mass, and more importantly, to iterate through these, allowing you to kind of turn the dials as you go. At some point, you should get to a position where this is an ongoing process that maybe once a month you're running a new test through the entire strategy, and then you're also tuning the way you're collecting that data, formatting that into the report, providing the recommendations back to those organizations or teams within your organization that need to implement or affect those changes. But I would say, the first one might take you 6 to 8 weeks. By the time you get this fully built out as a strategic program within your security operations practice, you can probably run, one a week if you were so inclined.
The next one is, does SentinelOne follow MITRE fully in its action? Or with more frameworks are there in S1? So I want to say that in our product, if you look at any of our products, we have MITRE TTPs mapped throughout, and it's to the entire process. Whether you're doing detections, you can see in the console like what actually the MITRE techniques were used, what tactics were used. If you're doing threat hunting, you can actually hunt with MITRE TTPs. You can even hunt with stuff like data exfiltration or initial access, just like a broader category. So we have MITRE kind of woven in through a lot of stages of our product, and as we look at doing more product improvements, this is holistically kind of inbuilt. We have around 350 plus techniques that's currently mapped, and we continually increase that number on a daily basis. Another question, Michael, and that would be for you is, would you provide more information on how you protect identity versus infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So identities as an entity need to be protected in a couple of locations. One, not many people think about the fact that on any given endpoint, I'm going to have not just access to my domain, and I'm going to authenticate to that domain via credentials that are stored and validated via either single sign-on or an IAM product, but I also have credentials I'm storing locally, and not many enterprises prevent you from, let's say, storing passwords in Chrome, storing my credentials in PuTTY, right? So I've got credential stores locally that are potentially at risk from an adversary leveraging tools like Mimikatz and even memory dumps. So protecting the identities that are being stored, those credential pairs on device, is one area where I think many customers are exposed. But the majority of the identities we think about protecting are the ones being stored, and authenticated via Active Directory. And I mentioned the assessment capability that allows us to identify the vulnerabilities in AD. So a simple assessment might come back and tell me things like, I have a number of accounts that have excessive privileges assigned, and that the password length is too short, the password never expires. So some of it is simple governance related assessments. Do I have the right password hygiene? Do I have the right privilege assignments? The other study that we use from a cloud infrastructure protection perspective is, and I think it was AWS that actually gave us this information, 98% of cloud privileges are over applied to users. Most users use only 2% of the privileges they're granted in cloud workloads. So you can see the huge disparity of, if I only need 2% of what you've given me, but you've given me everything I need to be dangerous to the asset or the enterprise, then I really need to think about shifting that model. And so there's technology that we have that allows us to evaluate the privileges that are required, think zero trust, think least privilege model, to help us understand that those identities and the entitlements they're granted need to be managed to a level of governance that is safe for the organization, that does not provide unnecessary exposure or privilege escalation capabilities. So identity and the infrastructure that support it are really two different paths of the same vector, and that is protect the credentials and protect the environment that is used to host and authenticate those credentials.
Okay. I believe your XDR product is cloud solution only. Can you please confirm? No, we not only have cloud deployment, but we also offer on-prem deployment to, comply with any of the regulations you have, or if that is what you need. So on-prem deployment is also available. What other players do you work with, or do you work with smaller entities? I am presuming this means in terms of our integrations. So our XDR platform, we believe in an open approach. Realistically speaking, in a SOC, you will have a bunch of different solutions and technologies deployed, and you want to make sure that everybody talks to each other and they're not deployed in silo. So we integrate with many major vendors, whether it's email like Proofpoint, Mimecast, whether it's SIM and SOAR like Splunk and Phantom and Demisto and a bunch of other SIMs, to network players and to other solutions and technologies. And you can find the entire list of our integrations on our website under Marketplace. And if you guys need any more information, or if you're looking to integrate for other vendors, reach out to us and we're happy to give you more information.
I'll add one more point on that. You mentioned about the technology integrations we have via our ecosystem. Let me also mention the services partners that we also have. Obviously, we have a services arm of our own called Vigilance, but we're also partnered with some of the largest MSSPs and incident response companies out there, companies like Kroll and Mandiant and KPMG. So if you think that this practice looks a little daunting to you, think about leveraging one of our partners that can help you bring this tooling to bear, helping you understand how to at least build out the process of doing so. Maybe you don't need to employ them full-time or in perpetuity, but maybe at least they help you get going. They help you build out your strategy, your test plan, your tooling scenario, and your reporting guidelines. And then once they've done a knowledge transfer, maybe that's something you can take on yourself, but don't forget services is a key part of any one of these strategies, and leverage the service vendors and partners we have as well.
I think that's a great point, Michael. I think I forgot to mention services, but absolutely key part in this strategy. The next question is, do you work in government or educational sector? Absolutely. We do have customers and we support those. There are resources on our website like white papers and ebooks that can help you give more information. Another one is, should these adversary emulation plans be focused on third-party vendors, vendor access to systems? I think the adversary emulation plans should be designed to, your specific organization and what is, vulnerable in your organization. And if you have a lot of third-party vendor access, third-party vendors that's accessing your system, absolutely, you should take a look at how to incorporate that into the emulation plan. Somebody mentioned that they would like to have further discussion about a unique environment. Absolutely. Please feel free to reach out to us for any specific questions that you have, any additional details that you want. And I think that is all the questions we've had, and which is perfect. It's right on the dot. In case you've not gotten to your question, we will definitely follow up further. But thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your time and hope this was useful. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Risha.